4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
I'm Ray Addison. Here's the latest from the GB Newsroom. 2 cabinet ministers are rejecting Labour's calls for the government to urgently impose a windfall tax on oil and gas firms. Labour says the revenue could be used to ease the burden of rising household bills. However, the Health and Northern Ireland secretaries say it wouldn't work and would have a long-term impact on businesses. Greg Marsh, CEO of Nous, which works with families to deal with the cost of living crisis, told GB News regulators could do more to stop rising energy prices.
We believe that the government will have to do more. We think that there will need to be intercession. One of the things they could do, for instance, is use the existing regulators, Ofcom and Ofgem, who regulates the communications industry and the energy industry, to put more pressure on the regulated providers of energy, the regulated providers of mobile phone services and broadband services, to ensure that those companies aren't increasing their prices above the rate of inflation, which is something many of them are doing.
The Rail, Maritime and Transport Union says any attempt by the government to make rail strike action illegal will be met with the fiercest resistance. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps told the Sunday Telegraph ministers are considering introducing a minimum staff requirement during rail strikes. That's as more than 40,000 RMT union members at Network Rail and train operators vote on whether to take industrial action over jobs, pay and conditions. Former political strategist to Tony Blair, John McTernan, told GB News the Transport Secretary faces an uphill battle.
The rail unions are turning on Grant Shapps. He wants to nationalise the unions. He gets the responsibility of dealing with the pay. You can't have it both ways. He wants Great British Railways. He wants to say he's in charge of the railways. Well, he is in charge. So therefore, he's taken workers in the private sector where they were perfectly capable of bargaining with employers. And now he wants to bargain with them. He wants to give the railway workers the same 1.5% pay deal he's offering to teachers and to nurses and civil servants.
Ukraine has ruled out a ceasefire or concessions to Moscow as Russian forces intensify an offensive in the eastern Donbas region. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has cut off its gas supply to Finland after the country refused Moscow's demands to pay in rubles. Ukraine's presidential advisor says Kyiv won't accept any deal that involves giving up territory.
Any concession to the Russian Federation would instantly lead to an escalation of the war. So the war will not stop. It will just be put on pause for some time. After a while, with renewed intensity, the Russians will build up their weapons, manpower, and work on their mistakes. And they'll start a new offensive, even more bloody and large-scale.
And people have gathered for a minute of silence at Manchester Piccadilly train station, marking the 5th anniversary of the city's arena bombing terror attack. More than 20,000 people have also taken part in the Great Manchester Run to pay tribute to the victims. 22 people were killed and hundreds injured when a bomb detonated at an Ariana Grande concert in May 2017. That's it. We'll be back with more news in a moment.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking fine with some late sunshine in the southeast, but cloudier and wetter elsewhere. Here's the details. A closer look at the southwest, and here it's going to turn cloudier by the evening with some outbreaks of rain likely, particularly for Cornwall and North Devon. In the southeast and around London, it will be a decent end to the day with some late sunshine for most here. Cloud will bring some rain across the parts of Wales this evening. It shouldn't be too heavy though, and there will be some breaks in the cloud. A similar picture for the West Midlands, where things will be a little damp due to a few spots of rain pushing in from the west. For many, it's going to be cloudy. It will be a little brighter perhaps in the northeast of England. There should be some evening sunshine around, but also a few showers, which could be a touch heavy. Across much of Scotland, it will be a wet end to the day with the heaviest rain in the northwest. Some localised flooding is possible as we go through the night. It will be something of a mixed bag for Northern Ireland with some bright or sunny spells, but also a little showery rain lingering through the evening and overnight. The heaviest rain will clear Scotland overnight, but further outbreaks here and for Northern Ireland too, turning drier for England and Wales. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
This is The Political Correction. I'm Deanna Davison, and today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry and by Arlene Foster in Northern Ireland. The General Secretary of the RMT Union, Mick Lynch, has warned that a proposed rail strike would bring the country to a standstill, prompting Transport Secretary Grant Shapps to consider drawing up laws requiring a minimum number of rail staff to work during a strike. And if those numbers were not met, the industrial action would be deemed illegal. It's also been revealed that the Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, is examining plans to bolster the rights of teachers who choose not to join unions. Well, it's a union story, so where else to start but with our very own Paul Embry. Paul, what do you make of these proposals?
Well, I think they're wrong. I think they seek to change the goalposts. I mean, if we believe in the right to strike, then it seems to me that if you then put obstacles in the way of as a government to try to make it virtually impossible to strike, then probably you don't believe in the right to strike in the first place. And I think any civilised modern democracy should defend the right of people to withdraw their labour if they believe they've got a genuine grievance. And these proposals from government to make it more difficult for people to strike seem to me to be a bit like a boxer who, having started the boxing match and knows the rules, gets hit and suddenly says, well, I don't want you to hit me hard again, so I'm going to order you to fight with one hand tied behind your back. And the truth is, Deanna, where has this come from? It's come from the fact that workers are sick and tired of having to pay the price for an economic situation that was not of their making. First of all, the financial crisis, now the cost of living crisis. For a decade, they had to put up with austerity. Now they're struggling to make ends meet as a result of the cost of living crisis. Many workers, both in the public sector and the private sector, have not had decent pay increases for many years. They see directors' pay running away at a rate far more than their own pay does. And frankly, people have had enough, and they're organising through their collective institutions, their trade unions, to hit back, and I think they're right to do so, and I think the Tories should listen to them rather than trying to crush them.
No, but there's a difference between, a small-scale strike that's going to affect your employer and a strike that is potentially going to shut down the transport system of an entire country, holding the country to ransom. Can't you see how annoyed people are going to get by this, Paul?
Well, I think, look, if you're a trade unionist and if you're a trade union that's taking industrial action, then I don't think it's right or reasonable to expect the trade union to take action and to choose tactics that reduce its own leverage. Plainly, as a trade union, and you're trying to win a dispute, you are going to try to maximise your leverage. That's not unreasonable to me, and I don't think it's surprising. just as the government and an employer would seek to do exactly the same thing from their point of view to try to undermine the strike action. But look, as I said, Deanna, people in this country are struggling to make ends meet. For a long time now, they've had to pay the price of decisions taken by others, of decisions taken by government, of crimes that were committed by the bankers. And they've been told, look, you have to pay the price of those decisions. And I think they're at the end of their tether. And it's a long time, frankly, since we had concerted industrial action in this country on a widespread and on a national scale. But the point that I would make is workers don't resort to that unless they think they're genuinely justified. When people take strike action, they lose money themselves. And during a cost of living crisis, that is going to have a particularly acute effect on them. They're doing it because they feel that they're justified, and rather than trying to take the big stick approach, which is what the government is doing, get around the table, listen to their grievances, listen to the fact that real wages are falling, listen to the fact that, austerity has had a real impact over the last decade and people are struggling to put food on the table. And then, if they listen, then they might have a proper solution.
So, Arlene, I want to bring you in on this. What do you make of the fact that the RMT are proposing these kind of wide-scale strikes? And do you think the government is justified in the action that they want to take?
Well, first of all, Paul's right. Workers will suffer if unions go on strike. But of course, that's always the case. It's the workers that suffer. It's not the union bosses that will suffer as a result of the strike that they're pushing. And I think it's quite disgraceful to read Mick Lynch's comments today as if he's celebrating the fact that he's going to have the biggest general strike since 1926, as if that's something that should be celebrated. There's no reality in respect of what's being proposed here, because workers will suffer. And I think it points again to the fact that trade unions are actually out of touch with the people that they are supposed to be representing. They should be representing them on the cost of living crisis. They should be representing them on the issues that matter to them. And we talked about this last week in terms of the student unions, the way in which a lot of unions have become so politicised that they've got themselves involved in a lot of issues that, frankly, they shouldn't be involved in. And I thought it was very interesting to read this morning that in terms of the education unions, only 30% believe, I think it was, that they are satisfied with the support that they gain from their union when they need their union. Their union should be there to support them when they're in difficulties, when they need their help, instead of all of this grandstanding around general strikes and trying to hold people to ransom.
And what about the government's proposed measures then? Because my understanding is it's looking specifically at ensuring there's a minimum number of people working so that essential services can remain. Do you think that sort of strikes the right balance?
Well, I do, because I think government has a responsibility to the wider public to make sure that public services are available for them when they need those public services. And that's why they're looking at putting these legislative pieces in place to try and protect the public, whilst union leaders are pushing ahead with strikes, which they know are going to cause great disservice to the general public. But despite that, they intend to push ahead, which I think is completely wrong.
Paul?
Well, I think it's impractical, because effectively what the government would be doing there is by saying there has to be a minimum number of people in work, they would be ordering union members to cross the picket line, to cross a picket line which is being manned by other union members. Now, frankly, it's a cardinal sin within the trade union movement to cross a picket line. It's something that you don't do. And if the government thinks it's wise to effectively order people to do it, then I suspect they're going to get a reaction that might surprise them. And I just think on a moral level, actually, it's wrong, because you're saying to a trade union, yes, of course we defend your right to strike, and yes, we accept that you've had a democratic ballot and a majority of your members have chosen to withdraw their labour, but actually we're going to ignore that, and what we're going to do is to send some of your members into work anyway. Well, I mean, that's a way effectively of rendering the right to strike meaningless. Because what you do is say, well, any impact that the strike is likely to have in terms of leverage on the employer becomes completely diminished. And as I say, we've already got in this country some of the most restrictive trade union laws in the advanced industrial world. It is not easy to go on strike in Britain. And when the Trade Union Act came in a few years ago, set minimum thresholds for turnouts, etc., it became even harder to take strike action. And like I said, Deanna, the truth is that people do not do it as a first resort. I've been on strike on a few occasions. I've stood on picket lines. I know how difficult it is. You agonise over the decision, particularly somebody like me in the fire service. You agonise over the decision, and you know the impact that it's going to have on your family financially as well. But you do it because you've got a genuine grievance. And if anyone can say to me that workers in this country have not got a genuine grievance after 12 years of an economic situation that they have had to pay for and that they've had to bear the brunt of, then I would say you're on a different planet to me. And rather than, as I say, take the sledgehammer approach, what the government needs to do is understand why workers are reacting like this, understand why they're threatening to take to picket lines, listen to their reasoning, get around the table and stop the inflated and the combative rhetoric.
But Paul, you talk about the rights of the workers who are within that trade union to go on strike, but what about the rights of ordinary people, other workers, to actually get to work? You know, this is absolutely key core infrastructure. Surely the government has a responsibility to everyone else to keep that going.
Well, what I would say, Deanna, is if you take that argument to its logical conclusion, then you effectively rule out the right to strike. That's where that argument takes you. Because, of course, by definition, any strike, any industrial action will cause disruption to operations. I mean, let's be brutally honest. That's the purpose of taking strike action in the first place, because, you know, you want to withdraw your labour in order to send a message to your employer or the government, whoever it is, that this is what we are worth, this is what can happen if we weren't here. I think if you come along and say, well, you know, we because other people have got to get to work, we're effectively just going to rule your strike illegal, then I think that's a nuclear option, really, and one that I have to say is not commensurate with a modern democratic society where workers should have the right to withdraw their labour. No one wants to see a summer of discontent, by the way. Nobody wants to see public services come to a halt. But there's a reason why it's happening, and it's the anger that is bubbling away beneath the surface of people who feel that they're just at the end of their tether after being forced to pay the price for decisions that are made by government and bankers. And like I say, the responsible, reasonable thing for a government to do is not to say we're effectively going to ban your strike action as good as, but yes, you've got a grievance, we know your real wages are falling, we know you've suffered austerity, we know you're struggling to put food on the table. Let's have a plan to deal with that instead.
Arlene, I want to come back to something you said there, which was about unions often getting overly politicised and getting a little bit out of touch with their actual membership. To me, it feels like the reason that the strike, particularly in London, has been called on Jubilee weekend is not just to cause the maximum possible disruption. To me, that feels very politically charged in some sort of weird anti-monarchy sentiment from some of these highly politicised union leaders. Do you agree?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I mean, the fact that they are targeting the Jubilee weekend, the fact that it's going to impact, I understand, on the stations which are right beside Buckingham Palace, Green Park, I think is one of the stations affected. I understand there's been a grievance between the employees and management in and around that area now for some time. Why it hasn't been dealt with, I don't know. But to target Jubilee weekend is malicious, and it actually is very damaging, I think, for those of us who want to celebrate the Jubilee weekend, to look on and say, you're only doing this because it's a celebration of the monarchy, and you're doing it this weekend to cause as much annoyance as you possibly can. And I think it's completely wrong. And that threat to strike on Jubilee weekend should be removed, and it should be removed very quickly, because I think the unions need to have the support of the public. I think Paul will recognise that if they're going on strike. And if they're doing something as politically charged as that, they will lose support. And I think they need to withdraw it immediately.
Paul, I'm curious about that. Do you think tactically this has been a bit of a miscalculation by the unions? Because this is really, really going to frustrate people, isn't it? And as Arlene said, you're not going to have the support of the public.
Well, I mean, I guess we'll have to wait and see. I think that it's not just trade unionists who are quite angry at the situation that they're finding themselves in at the moment. I think it's millions of workers across the country, not just in the public sector, but the private sector as well. But what I would say, Deanna, on the broader point about trade unions, let's not lose sight of the fact that pretty much every advance that has ever been won by working people in this country has come about as a result of trade unions, as a result of trade union campaigning. whether it's the national minimum wage, whether it's decent health and safety laws, whether it's annual leave, for example, protections in the workplace, decent pay and conditions and pensions and so on. No employer or government ever comes along to a group of workers and hands them these things on a plate. Workers have to organise through their collective institutions and to fight and to struggle in order to secure them. And that's historically what the trade union movement has done in Britain. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that every action that is ever taken by a trade union everybody has to agree with, but it certainly is to recognise the importance of trade unions in delivering for workers over the generations. And there are workers today who enjoy much better conditions of service and better protections in the workplace, not just in the public sector but the private as well, as a result of that sustained campaigning by trade unions. Let's never forget that.
Well, Oh, of course, Arlene.
I just wanted to ask Paul about the poll that was carried out in education unions, which has come back to say that only 30% believe that they get the support that they need. I have to say that is reflected in my experience when I was a member of the Legislative Assembly here in Northern Ireland. When I went to trade unions to try and get them to support some of my constituents, they would support them so far, and then they dropped them just as they were about to go into a tribunal. So I recognise that statistic, and I have to say it is disappointing that actually unions aren't supporting the people that they should be supporting and instead involving themselves in politics. Do you recognise that?
Well, I would be the first to say, Arlene, that some trade union leaderships on certain issues, I think, are out of touch with their members. I mean, I've said that publicly. I think that unions are not so good these days at concentrating on the bread and butter issues affecting their members, pay and conditions in the workplace, which arguably these summer disputes we're talking about do focus on those issues. I think there are some trade union leaderships that have followed a kind of almost like a militant woke line that does not rest easy with millions of their members, and actually as a result of that have alienated millions of their members. And that's actually a battle that I've had within the trade union movement personally. So yeah, of course, there are internal things that go on within trade unions that members are not happy with. I get that. But broadly speaking, as a principle, I think trade unions are absolutely a force for good in our country. As I said, they've delivered many, many positive things for workers over the generations. And whatever our individual criticisms of certain trade union leaderships, we shouldn't lose sight of that fact.
Well, we want to hear from you. Let us know, what do you think? Do you think these strikes are justified? Do you think the government's action is justified? Let us know by emailing us on gbviews@gbnews.uk. And most importantly, don't go anywhere, because coming up after the break, we're joined by the CEO of a company who say they are helping households stay vigilant in the face of rising prices.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. Chancellor Rishi Sunak is under increasing pressure to help more households as the cost of living crisis reaches record highs. And millions around the country feel the impact on their daily lives. But what exactly can the Chancellor do to ease the steep increase in prices? And indeed, what can individuals do to ensure they stay afloat in these economically turbulent times? Well, joining us now to discuss this is Greg Marsh, who's the founder and CEO of Nous, which describes itself as a company that helps households get smart and stay vigilant against the rising cost of living. Greg, thank you for joining us this morning. So you've got a pretty important job at the moment. Tell me kind of how much engagement you're getting from people to try and find these money-saving tips.
We've been inundated with people coming to our services and our website trying to find out more about what they can do, practical advice and practical tips. One of the things that we've been tracking over the last few months is that while there is increasing awareness among householders of how serious this problem is. People are now talking to their friends, they're talking to their neighbours, they're having these conversations around the cost of living crisis. Most people in the UK still think this is not going to happen to them. They still think this is someone else's problem before it's their own. Now, those on lower incomes, those on universal credit or who benefit from the Warmer Homes discount, they're really feeling it already. But the challenge is that over the next few months, as energy prices rise further, and as other cost of living costs kick in, this is a problem that's really going to hit all of us. It's going to hit middle income households. It's going to even hit higher income households. We're all going to have to make very significant changes to how we spend our money, what we spend our money on in order to navigate through this very tough period for UK households.
So can we talk about some of the kind of key tips that you're giving people? And I think one area I probably want to touch upon is energy, because energy is a huge concern at the moment. What advice can you give people on that front?
The challenge is there's very little you can really do to reduce the costs of your energy bills other than changing how much energy you consume. Now, we've all heard about how serious that is for some families. We've had people get in touch with us telling us that they are literally feeling suicidal because of their rising energy bills and how serious that's affecting their homes. We've had people tell us that they are literally struggling or having to make impossible choices about whether to be warm enough or whether to feed their children. So this is not an easy problem, and many households already have made practical changes to how they consume energy. They're having shorter showers in the morning. They're trying to make sure they've dialed their thermostat down. But honestly, it's patronizing for us to sort of give people advice. People who really have already felt the pinch know that, and they're doing what they can. There's not that much you can do in terms of finding cheaper deals. There may be other places that you can cut your costs. One of the key things you can do is get smart about all the other things you buy every month. About 16 million UK households are out of contract for a broadband or mobile phone provider, or their car or home insurance has been allowed to roll on to a higher price deal because they haven't shopped for a cheaper one. So one of the things that our service at Nous.co does, and there are other similar tools out there, is it makes a list of all the things that you're spending money on every month or every year, and make sure you go through those with a fine-tooth comb and say, right, am I out of contract? Could I find a cheaper deal? And what else is out there? And to be honest, do I even need to buy this? You know, the things that we all had to have around us during the lockdown when we had nothing else to do. Well, the weather's nice. You can go outside now. There are cheaper ways of entertaining yourselves than those expensive subscription services. And maybe now's the time to make those tough decisions.
And I want to talk a little bit about government intervention so far. The government's gone so far, but if you could send a message to government right now, what would it be?
We think that the government will have to go further, and we think that some of the initiatives that we saw in the Chancellor's spring statement, for instance, the £200 energy bills support scheme, which has provided, or will provide, I should say, some little comfort to households, we think that's going to have to go further. We would suggest that there might need to be an extension to that scheme. The debate about windfall taxes for the energy companies, you know, whether or not you levy a windfall tax doesn't actually affect the households who are currently feeling the pinch. That affects how the government pays for whatever additional measures that it might need to introduce. So again, we think the real debate is not whether you fine the energy companies or whether you find the money under the pillows and at the Treasury. The real question is how you make sure that households who most need help get it. One of the shocking bits of information that came to light about a week ago was from the Office of National Statistics, who shared that the lowest income households, so those on the lowest quintile of income, about 40% of those households were now struggling to pay their bills on time. And the challenge is that's a proportion that's only rising as time goes on. So we believe that the government will have to do more. We think that there will need to be intercession. One of the things they could do, for instance, is use the existing regulators, Ofcom and Ofgem, who regulates the communications industry and the energy industry, to put more pressure on the regulated providers of energy, the regulated providers of mobile phone services and broadband services, to ensure that those companies aren't increasing their prices above the rate of inflation, which is something many of them are doing. But again, it's incumbent on all of us as households to get smart about what we're spending on, make sure if we're out of contract that we've got a better deal, and use the tools like Now.co and others that are out there to get smart about your household finances and make a plan.
Brilliant. Well, Greg, thank you so much for those tips there and for your insights. That's Greg Marsh, the founder and CEO of Nous. But we're moving from cost of living onto something interesting. Sunday Times Rich List has been published for this year, and it's found that Britain's super rich have grown their combined fortunes by 8% to a record $710 billion in the last 12 months. The 34th edition of the prestigious rankings identify a record 177 UK billionaires. And Chancellor Rishi Sunak becomes the first frontline politician to be ranked amongst the country's richest people. Well, earlier here on GB News, the compiler of the list, Robert Watts, told us why the list is so important for transparency.
We realised in February time, we'd sort of locked onto the fact that the Chancellor and his family would feature onto the Sunday Times Rich List in the past, and I think that he sort of makes the case more for riches almost better than I could myself, and the fact that there are a lot of people who don't want a rich list to exist. They don't want us to track these people because they think it's sort of gaudy. And the people on the list would rather we stop doing what we do at times, or some of them would do anyway, because they want the privacy. They want to be able to accumulate their wealth quietly without scrutiny. We think it's a very important functioning part of a democracy is that we know where wealth is being accumulated and where it lies. I think the fact that the person in charge of the public finances, in charge of tax in this country, has now made it onto this list, I think perfectly demonstrates why we need to do what we do.
Well, that was Robert Watts, who compiled the Sunday Times Rich List. Paul, I want to come to you on this. What do you make of the fact that the Chancellor is on this list?
I mean, I'm not particularly in favour of kind of personalising issues in this way and picking on particular people or particular politicians and highlighting their wealth. Having said that, I do think there's an argument to be made that if you are the Chancellor of the Exchequer and you are ultimately making decisions in terms of public finances and you're telling people how they can save money, etc., then if you personally are so insulated, as clearly Rishi Sunak and his family are, from the everyday effects of the cost of living crisis, then people probably are entitled to question the credibility of statements that are made by the Chancellor on issues like that. I think the bigger issue in many respects, Deanna, is not just about one individual. It's about the fact that there's a rich list that shows a huge disparity in wealth in this country between rich and poor. That's the real issue here, and that's a disparity, by the way, that increased as a result of the pandemic. There were some people at the top of society who did very, very well, thank you, out of the pandemic, when millions of people at the lower end of the scale took a big hit. And those are the issues that we need to address, and we need to address how we close that gap, because an increasing gap between rich and poor is never healthy for any country and invariably ends in tears. And why isn't the government, for example, talking about a wealth tax? A wealth tax of 1% on the richest people would raise billions of pounds to fund our public services, to give people decent pay increases, to fund the National Health Service and schools, etc. But that doesn't even seem to be part of the government's thinking, and that's disappointing, I think.
Arlene, what's your read on this?
Well, I mean, we always look forward to the rich list coming out, don't we, just to check about who's on it and who's not on it. And I think there is a bit of the politics of envy that comes out during this time, and we look at it and we're very envious about what's going on. But listening to the compiler of the rich list, I mean, I, like Paul, I'm a little bit, it's really into people's private lives and what they do in their private lives. But at the same time, I do recognise that when you have on the rich list the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think that is something that we need to be aware of, because absolutely, I mean, he could be making decisions which impact upon his wealth. And I think that we need to be aware that he is one of the richest people in the UK. And I think there's very much maybe a conflict of interest in relation to that. And it's something that not only he should consider, but that the Prime Minister should consider. I mean, you do get down to the fact that he is in charge of the public finances. It's him that makes the decisions for everybody in the UK, and he's one of the richest people in the UK. So, that's something to think about, and I'm sure it's something that will be in the minds of the Prime Minister when he has his reshuffle coming up, whenever that comes.
Mm-hmm. Well, let us know your thoughts. Send us your views. We always want to hear from you. What did you make of this year's Sunday Times Rich List? Email us gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, welcome back to The Political Correction, and loads of you getting in touch. So many of you that we've got a massive piece of paper. That's a normal size, and that's the size of the one with the views on, so you can see loads of you getting in contact. John Taylor here says, the unions made this country a laughingstock in the 1970s. Margaret Thatcher broke them and restored some pride. It seems the unions want to take us back to those dark days of the 1970s. Paul, over to you.
Well, I mean, look, that's people always say that, don't they? Whenever workers, come together and say, we're not accepting this anymore, we want fairness, we want a decent pay increase. Oh, you're taking us back to the 1970s. I just don't think it's either realistic, actually, a fair interpretation of history, or reasonable interpretations of what unions are asking for now. Anyway, Mick, on the same theme but taking a different point of view, says, I've always voted Conservative and always been a trade unionist. The right to strike must be upheld. Good for you, Mick, on the being a trade unionist thing, not on the voting Conservative.
Arlene, over to you.
Yeah, so Camilla says to strike at occasions that hurt as many people as possible cannot be justified. It is blackmail at its worst and should be curtailed. So I think she's on the side of the Tories taking action in relation to strikes, Deanna.
Now, the Liberal Democrats have warned that England is facing a dentist shortage crisis as 14% of NHS dentists approach retirement. The party's spokesperson for health, Daisy Cooper, said ministers were asleep at the wheel, adding it was no wonder people were turning to DIY dentistry. Spokesperson for the Department of Health said the government had provided an extra £50 million to fund up to 350,000 extra dental appointments. Paul, what do you make of this? Have you had any sort of trouble yourself accessing dentistry services?
I mean, I think the Lib Dems have got a point, actually, and good on them for raising it. I think there is a real dental crisis in this country, which has been exacerbated, actually, as a result of the pandemic, when dental surgeries were operating on reduced capacity. That's created all sorts of problems in terms of people having personal problems and reopening afterwards and having that backlog. And I think there is a real problem in the sense that, you know, poor people can't afford to go private. If you've got wealth, then you can afford to bypass the National Health Service and book a private appointment, often with the same dentist, bizarrely. But poor people don't have that luxury. So what they end up doing is either suffering in pain or, as you said in the intro there, Deanna, undertaking DIY dentistry, which, you know, is an unconscionable thing, I think, for any person to ever have to consider. But I think on the broader point, actually, it's kind of, it's indicative of what I think is a wider problem of things just not quite working properly. It's not just dentists, it's GP surgeries. Nowadays, if you try to book an appointment with your GP, you're having to wait for 6 weeks. If you want to get a passport, you struggle to get a passport. If you want a new driving licence, you struggle. If you try and contact HMRC, it's a problem. The whole thing has got a sense of the system not working properly and actually falling down. And I think what we see in the crisis in the dentistry service is really an example of that.
Well, Paul, is this you saying that the state isn't always the best provider of services?
The state can be the best provider of services, provided it's managed properly and funded properly, and under Conservative governments, that's generally not the case. There's your answer to that.
I knew that would be the comeback. Arlene, what have you seen in Northern Ireland with dentistry services? Is it a very similar picture?
It is a similar picture, Deanna, and I have to say I agree with Paul on the GPs as well, because that's a real problem here in Northern Ireland. As you know, GPs in the past used to be single GP operations. People have moved away from that into federations and working together in practices, and it's very difficult for people to access their GP now in a way that they did in the past when we were growing up. It was very easy to access your GP and get a same-day appointment, and that's now not the case. And I think that's something that's fundamentally wrong there, and it needs to be fixed. And I don't agree that government is the answer to all of the problems, but government have a role to play in relation to dealing with the dental issues and indeed the GP issues as well.
Well, joining us now to discuss this story more is Lib Dem Treasury spokesperson Christine Jardine. Christine, thank you for joining us on this story. Tell us, you know, what is the Lib Dem stance? What more do you think should be done?
Well, we have a situation at the moment where 1 in 8 dentists is approaching retirement age. And we have, in Scotland, there is a problem as well. And we had 400,000 fewer appointments through the NHS after the pandemic than before the pandemic. Now, that's an awful lot of people not going to the dentist. It's particularly bad. The shortage is particularly bad in rural areas of England like Cornwall, Dorset, Devon, and there's also a GP crisis. So we are facing a situation where we really have to do something. And instead of just throwing £50 million at the problem and then waiting to see what happens, and it's interesting, when the Minister answered the question this week, that she didn't actually know how many dentists had applied for this money and how much support there was. So we have to incentivise dentists to be offering NHS appointments to people. We have to be encouraging them to make that time available and funding those appointments, because let's not forget, toothache, it's very painful, but it can also be indicative of of a different health problem. It can be indicative of a heart problem. It can be mouth cancers. It can be all sorts of things. So the worst possible thing is for people not to be going and getting it checked out and getting treatment. And this is what we have to be looking at now. Something has to be done about this shortage. And the government can't just sit in its hands. It has to incentivise NHS work and make sure the funding is there for more dentists. Because if 1 in 8 are going to retire, then we're going to face a shortage.
It should look like, Christine, in terms of trainee dentists, have we got huge numbers coming through, or do we need to do more to encourage young people to consider dentistry as a profession?
Well, we need to do more. And we also have health services generally. I don't think we're doing enough to encourage young people to take those courses through university and hospitals and get into the profession. And we do have a shortage of dentists coming through. And those 1 in 8, if they retire, that's a huge loss to dental care in England. And in Scotland, we're seeing the same thing. And we saw at the switchover about 20 years ago in Scotland, there was a huge shortage of NHS dentists. And we had people queuing in the street to have their teeth looked at because it was so bad. Now, that's a basic health service, and we are getting to the point where we're just not providing it in the way that we promise to people when we talk about cradle-to-grave care. It's just not there. And the point about it not just being dental services is absolutely right. In my constituency, my inbox is full every week of people who haven't been able to get driving licences, whose passports have gone missing or haven't come back in time, visas that the government is at the moment facing a huge backlog in visas. And part of that is understandable because of the number of refugees from Afghanistan and Ukraine, but they're not dealing with it. So all the government departments seem to be struggling to cope. And that's very dangerous for all of us.
I think there must be some recognition, though, that obviously the unprecedented impact of the pandemic will have had an impact on these services, though.
Well, it would have had an impact. At the time, we weren't able to go to the dentist. But now we should be seeing people going back to the dentist and able to go back to the dentist because there is an NHS service available to them. But at the moment, we're finding that is not the case. As I say, there's a drop in the number of NHS appointments, a massive drop in Scotland, almost 500,000. And we're looking at the situation where 1 in 8 dentists could be retiring shortly in the next 5 years. Now, we need to replace those dentists. We need to replace, those are all dentists, incidentally, providing NHS service. So we need to replace them, and we need to incentivise practices not to prioritise private care, but to prioritise NHS care. There are practices now which simply don't offer NHS care to patients. They're not taking on NHS patients. Now, that means you're getting an inequality of care in this country. People who can afford to go to the dentist are getting dental care, and people who can't are struggling to find it. And I think that's unacceptable.
And Christine, you're talking about incentivising practices to take on more NHS patients or to take them on at all. How would the Lib Dems propose doing that? Is it through a change in the law, a change in structures, or more financial incentives?
Yes, I mean, we do have to look at the contracts that dentists have and say, and have within the contracts an incentive to take on NHS patients. That would be the first thing that we would review. But also you need to make the funding available. And it's not simply good enough just to throw the funding at it, because that won't work without the incentives within the contracts that they have to do a certain percentage of NHS patients every month, every week, every year. And that way we can be sure that dentists are aware of the problem and aware of the necessity of providing it.
Brilliant. Well, Christine, thank you for joining us to discuss this morning. Christine Jardine, Lib Dem MP and Treasury spokesperson. Now, Jake Daniels has become the UK's first active male footballer to come out as gay since Justin Fashanu back in 1990. The 17-year-old forward, who plays for Blackpool FC in the Championship, has said the decision to go public with his sexuality will leave him feeling free and confident. Daniels has been congratulated for his bravery by the likes of Liverpool manager Jurgen Klopp, Man City forward Jack Grealish, and indeed the entire sporting community as a whole. Arlene, what did you make of this story? Because seeing Jake's kind of initial interview, I found it quite heartwarming myself.
Yeah, what struck me was the fact that it had been so long since Justin Fashanu, and I mean, it's quite incredible that he's only the second to come out and say that he's gay, and he feels strongly that he wants to talk about that so that he doesn't have to live some sort of a lie by pretending to be straight. But I mean, I found it initially I thought, why is this a story? And then when I heard that he was only the second to do it, I realised that's why it was a story, and that's why it had come to our attention. Really, from my point of view, it shouldn't be a story. If people have a different sexuality, that's a matter for them. It doesn't need to be talked about. But frankly, the fact that he's only the second is what makes it a story.
Mm-hmm. And also, gives him such a huge opportunity to act as a really positive role model for other young people coming up through football who realise that they can sort of be themselves and embrace their own sexuality.
Well, that they can be themselves indeed, and that they don't have to talk about it if they don't want to. But if they do want to talk about it, that's fine too. I think that's the important point, because I don't think people should be forced to talk about their sexuality if they don't want to. But if they do want to, that's fine as well, so that you have that choice and you can make it, and it's an individual matter for you.
And Paul, what did you make of this story? I mean, is it quite shocking that in 2022 we only have one active out footballer?
Well, it was unquestionably a brave thing to do, but I think, if we're honest, it was inevitable that it was going to be very well received by the footballing community, by the wider public, by the media, etc. So the kind of admiration and praise that was lavished on Jake Daniels wasn't particularly surprising, and I do contrast that with 32 years ago. I mean, I remember someone who's quite passionate about football. I remember Justin Fashanu coming out in 1990, and he had a pretty horrendous time because of it. And the difficulties that he faced compared to Jake Daniels' situation, I think, shows how football and society back then were very, very different. And of course, it's no bad thing that if, as Arlene said, someone wants to speak about their sexuality. I mean, I have to say, I'm frankly not that interested in the sexuality of footballers, but if they want to talk about it, then of course they're free to do so, and it's right and proper that their bravery is recognised.
Mm-hmm. But Paul, you wanted to contrast it with another case from football this week.
Yeah, Idrissa Gueye, the PSG player, who chose really as an act of conscience, because he's a devout Muslim, what we understand to be an act of conscience, so it's been reported, not to take part in a particular game because he was being asked alongside his teammates to display the rainbow symbol on his shirt, and he wasn't comfortable with that. And he didn't make any drama or fuss about it. He just simply quietly sat it out. And I think the contrast between that decision by Idrissa Gueye and the fierce condemnation that he received compared to the reaction with Jake Daniels is interesting. Now, people may say, well, the situations are completely different and Idrissa Gueye is some sort of homophobe. Now, you can disagree, but it was unquestionably, in my view, a brave thing to do, to say, look, effectively, I know I'm going to be hammered for this, but I do it because it's an act of conscience on my part. And I have to say, the reaction to him, I find slightly chilling. The fact that the French football authorities wrote to him, and the letter's subsequently been published, and it was a Gestapo-style letter, frankly, saying that we understand that this is what you've done, and we insist that you renounce your own views, words to that effect, and you should have a photograph taken of yourself wearing the shirt with the rainbow symbol. I think that kind of approach is pretty disgraceful, and I was struck really by the marked contrast in the two situations. And I don't like compelled speech. I don't like people being told they have to promote a particular ideology that they are not comfortable with, and that is what the situation with Idrissa Gueye ultimately boils down to.
Arlene, I see you nodding away there.
No, I entirely agree. I mean, the whole point is it should be choice, and it's a choice if you want to come out and talk about your sexuality. It's also a choice if you feel because of your religious convictions that you don't want to wear a rainbow symbol. And it's the fact that there's been such a Gestapo-like reaction to this young footballer who, as Paul said, didn't make a big issue about it. He just quietly said, I'm not going to play in the game. Wasn't making himself a poster boy in any way. But unfortunately for him, he has now become the recipient of attacks. And I think that's just wrong. I think it's very wrong. And if we live in a free society, there has to be choice.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to move on to a very short story before we go to our break, because celebrity chef and campaigner Jamie Oliver has been protesting outside Downing Street, armed with an Eton mess dessert. It was following a decision from the government to delay implementing part of its obesity strategy. It was announced last week that a ban on promotional offers around unhealthy food would be pushed back due to the cost of living crisis. And we talked about this on the show last week. Paul, what do you make of this protest? And isn't there something a little bit rich from multimillionaire Jamie Oliver saying the government are wrong to try and reduce the cost of food in the midst of a cost of living crisis?
Well, when I heard the term Eton mess, I thought that was the bloke who's going to be buying Twitter. I got that completely wrong. But look, I mean, I think this is a question of priorities, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I'm not particularly in favour of bans on certain foods. You know, I understand when we've got an obesity crisis, it's perhaps a good thing to warn people, you know, to have product warning and so on and so forth. I don't particularly like the idea of bans. And I just think at the moment, people's priority is just getting food on the table during a cost of living crisis. I tend to think you're right, Deanna. People don't take kindly to being lectured when they're struggling to make ends meet from rich celebrities saying you should pay for this food instead, which invariably is more expensive. So I saw the protest. It didn't particularly have my support, and I wouldn't have joined it if I were walking past, let's put it that way.
And Arlene, pretty pitiful protest, wasn't it?
It was, and I think the fact that he had an Eton mess, above all things, to protest about buy one, get one free was quite incredible. I mean, he's obviously tone deaf as to what is going on in the UK at the moment. And I listened to a young man who was on the protest, and he was saying how terrible it was that the government wasn't taking action to protect him against buy one, get one free. And I thought, well, you're not forced to buy one, get one free, you know. It's all of this.
Absolutely.
It's back to this scenario that government has to tell us what to do and to ban things for us to be. I mean, people have self-will. People have the ability not to do these things.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking fine with some late sunshine in the southeast, but cloudier and wetter elsewhere. Here's the details. A closer look at the southwest, and here it's going to turn cloudier by the evening with some outbreaks of rain likely, particularly for Cornwall and North Devon. In the southeast and around London, it will be a decent end to the day with some late sunshine for most here. Cloud will bring some rain across the parts of Wales this evening. It shouldn't be too heavy though, and there will be some breaks in the cloud. A similar picture for the West Midlands, where things will be a little damp due to a few spots of rain pushing in from the west. For many, it's going to be cloudy. It will be a little brighter perhaps in the northeast of England. There should be some evening sunshine around, but also a few showers, which could be a touch heavy. Across much of Scotland, it will be a wet end to the day with the heaviest rain in the northwest. Some localised flooding is possible as we go through the night. It will be something of a mixed bag for Northern Ireland with some bright or sunny spells, but also a little showery rain lingering through the evening and overnight. The heaviest rain will clear Scotland overnight, but further outbreaks here and for Northern Ireland too, turning drier for England and Wales. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media